Thanks, Doro, and I can confirm that I really enjoyed my first visit to Romania and even this visit. It's a beautiful country, so thanks, Doro, for a second invitation. What I'd like to share with you today is just some thoughts that I have as the director of IWA, and the sort of things I hear from various members of my association in terms of some of the challenges that they're facing and how they feel that regulators can help stimulate some of the innovation that they need to do within the sector, and also reflect a little bit on some of the issues that came out of our regulators forum in Copenhagen. So the water sector is changing, and it's having to change really out of necessity. We heard already about some of the global challenges that we face. We have, of course, climate change, which, as was mentioned earlier, is resulting in either too much water in places that we don't need it, or too little water in places where we do need it. They often say that if climate change is a shark, then water is really the teeth of that shark, right? And that water is really the medium through which we feel the impacts of climate change. Now, in the global south, in developing countries, you also have a problem of population growth, particularly urban population growth. And so we have huge numbers of people coming into cities, and at the same time we have the water resources diminishing, so this supply-demand deficit is there. And then, as was pointed out earlier as well, we have a lot of underground infrastructure that we haven't taken care of particularly well, and that requires huge amounts of investments. And we have an energy crisis. Water is heavy, and to move it long distances, it requires a lot of energy. To treat it, it requires a lot of energy. And we're facing challenges with respect to that. And of course, we're running out of money. So we are facing all these issues, and so the sector is trying to transition to a new normal to try and respond to some of these. I mean, if we just take the budget issue at hand, it's estimated that in order for us to meet the Sustainable Development Goals 6.1 and 6.2, which is really about water supply and wastewater and sanitation, they're estimating that we need about $115 billion a year to just be able to meet the targets that we've set ourselves. And 80% of countries, said that they just don't have that sort of money, and they're well away from having enough money to make the investments that they need. And that most of them have increased their water budgets, but they're still struggling. When we look at the equation for water, I think most of you know this, it's very easy. We have certain costs associated with building the infrastructure, replacing and then maintaining and operating that infrastructure. And usually the way in which we raise money is through tariffs, but we also often get subsidies from government, particularly in terms of the investments that we might have to make. And then we get some bilateral or multilateral funding to help build some of the infrastructure, say from the European Union or from the World Bank. So this is usually where the funds are, both for maintaining and operating our assets, but at the same time sort of trying to extend them. And there is this big financing gap, right? There's not enough money from these three non-repayable sources in order for us to meet the needs. And so most utilities now, and this is quite common certainly in Western Europe, they go to the commercial markets and borrow money. But in order to borrow money, it's very important that utilities are creditworthy. And creditworthy is really a reflection of a utility operating efficiently, both from a technical perspective, but also from an operational perspective. And in many countries, and you find this in some of the countries in Eastern Europe, certainly in Asia, Africa, and South America, the utilities are not operating sufficiently efficiently to sort of raise money from the markets. And this is where regulators can play an important role, because with the right policies, with the right sort of institutional setups, utilities can improve what they're doing. You've all probably know of, the vicious path or this spiral that, you start off with a low efficient utility with high water losses, and so you're actually having to pump more water, move more water, because you're losing large proportions of that water in the system. And this sort of makes your system more expensive than it has to be. And then because of that, you don't have money for your investments. So you postpone them, and then your service starts to deteriorate, and then you have this sort of knock-on effect, where as your service deteriorates, your customers are not as willing to pay, and then you don't get the subsidies from the government, and then your efficiency keeps dropping, and you get into this sort of spiral, or this vicious path, right, where you just put your head in the sand, your assets continually deteriorate, and you have no way out. And you find this certainly in many countries in the global south. This is sort of where they sit. And so they're unable to raise money to invest in their infrastructure. When you have good regulation, then, which encourages improved efficiencies and improves investments in efficiency gains, as opposed to just exploring new water sources and moving water from further distances, it encourages people to reduce their water losses. Then you start to see a better service, because you just become a more professional outfit as a utility. And then your customers are more satisfied because the performance levels of the system are better. And then you sort of have what you would call a virtuous path, right? And so things improve, the service levels are high, people are happy, you're able to generate the money to sort of invest in your infrastructure, and you have a successful system. And this is really where most utilities want to go. But this really requires a good sort of regulatory framework to encourage people to move in this direction. So regulators really play a very important role in moving utilities from this sort of vicious path to a virtuous path. And we see good examples. I travel a lot. I see good examples in certain African countries where good regulation has enabled them, and good governance, good government policies has enabled them to sort of improve the way in which they're operating, and now they're able to raise money for their new investments. The other thing that you notice is because, and it was mentioned earlier, because of climate change, our need to adapt to some of the challenges we face, we have the water sector really recognizing that they can't do water the way they've been doing it in the past. Most of our systems, our linear water systems, where we take water from afar, we treat it, we use that water once, and then we throw it away. Very often we don't treat the water properly before we throw it away. These systems were really built in the 19th century, the ideas behind them. And this is when we thought that populations would remain small. We thought that water was abundant and it would never run out. And we thought that the environment was benign and we could just throw things back. Now we realize that's not the case. And so you're seeing a shift in the way that people within the water sector are thinking. They're starting to think much more about the productive use of water. What is it they want the water to do for them? And how can they match the quantity and the quality of water for that intended use? So if they want to drink water, they need a certain quantity, a certain quality. If they want to water their plants or clean their cars, they don't need such high quality water for those purposes. So they're trying to match the quantity and quality for the intended use. That results in a more sort of circular approach, because we start using water multiple times. And we're also starting to see big developments in extracting value from the waste streams. And so energy is one of the products that we're able to extract from our waste streams, but also there are other products like nutrients and bioplastics and things. So there's a big move to see if we can generate revenue from extracting some value from our waste streams. So this is the way the sector is trying to transition intellectually. This is the discussions that you see a lot in the IWA, for example. But one of the problems that these decision makers have is they recognize there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. If you take climate change, there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly if you look at, say, water resource planning. Because, you have these GCM models where even the scenarios are not clear, what you're sort of forcing them with. And then when you start to downscale, you have, this cascade of uncertainties when you move from sort of atmospheric models to hydrological models and then to your water resource models. So there's lots of challenges. But now, when we think about things like climate, the pandemic, the energy crisis, there's lots of unknowns around, how should I manage the water sector moving forward? And these decision makers, they want to do what's on the top. They want to transition to a more intelligent way of managing water, but their fear and the fact that they don't really know what the future looks like means that they tend to replace old with new. They just reinforce the old paradigm, and they don't have the courage to sort of transition to a new normal. And that's because they have to make decisions today. And those decisions last for 20 to 40 years, right? So when you put a pipe in the ground, it's not for a few years, right? It's for a long time. And when you're forced to make those decisions, you want to do something in a certain way, you don't know if it's going to pay off because you don't know what the future is. So you tend to sort of resort to just reinforcing the old. And this is the sort of thing we're trying to unlock, right, with key utility leaders. One of the important things that you see in this transition is our need to view the whole water cycle as one. And the shift that you see happening within the water sector is that they're starting to look at all the water that flows within this water cycle as good water. They're just waters of different qualities, but they're all valuable sources. And what you're seeing now is, rather than when you have a need for some additional demand, rather than just going afar and extracting water from, say, another river or from groundwater to meet that demand, you're investing much more in efficiency gains within your system. So if I needed some more drinking water, which is high quality, should I go to a river and bring that water to the city or extract from the ground? Or should I invest in leakage management that frees up very high quality drinking water? And or should I impose sort of demand conservation measures that frees up high quality drinking water? If I want to wash my car or water my plants, should I really extract more surface water? Or should I use my grey water that I've generated or my treated black water for those purposes, right? Because they don't have to be high quality drinking water. So by looking at all of these water flows and understanding what your needs are in the future, you can match these different qualities of water for different types of uses. And we see a lot of developments in terms of the modelling of these systems, where we're starting to model flows and contaminant fluxes across the system, and we're trying to match these different grades of water for different uses. And we see modelling taking place where we're starting to model packets of water as they move through the system. And these packets of water have a sort of a digital ledger, which tells you how much energy was expended in producing that packet, what are the different chemicals that were input into that packet. And then you can sort of start to match these different grades for different uses. And you see some really good, interesting studies. This was some work I did some time ago in Nairobi, where the natural response to the growing demand was to just look for new surface water. So these are just new surface water sources to meet the growing demand. And at the top you can see what the unit cost for that water would be. But once you start doing this type of modelling and you start looking for efficiencies from within your system, you can actually generate most of the water you need without having to move water long distances. So it's much more energy intensive, and it's a much more rational thing to do, right? To sort of minimize your losses. And this has been published in a book if you want. The other area where we're seeing the circularity narrative evolving is around nature-based solutions. How can we better use nature to sort of manage our water systems? And this becomes quite challenging, particularly from a regulatory framework, because the numbers are not clear. But if you look at, say, how we protect our water bodies, right, we can use vegetation and other forms of filtering the water so that when the runoff actually takes place, it doesn't pollute the water. And there's been a lot of work on ecohydrology, which is essentially the use of vegetation to filter the water. When we then extract the water from our water sources, we can use things like riverbank and lake bank filtration, so the soil sort of filters the water. And then once we've used the water, we can treat that water using nature-based solutions, things like constructed wetlands. And then after we've treated them with things like, say, a constructed wetland or a stabilization pond, we can use things like the soil to polish the water to a high quality before it gets reused. So there is an opportunity to use nature-based solutions as well to close. And what we find is that while these nature-based solutions might require more land, their energy footprint is much smaller, right? And so again, it's addressing a little bit this other side of the equation, which is really around mitigation and decarbonization. So there's a lot of work going on in this sort of circularity discussion, and I feel that it's very important for the regulating community to really help facilitate this transition, right? Because currently it often hinders because of this nervousness, because of the public health concerns, this nervousness of using different grades of water for different types of uses. But really, with some of the challenges we face from climate, we're going to have to be more intelligent about the way we use water and the way in which we reuse water. The other area is when we look at the broader sort of economic benefits of water. And, you know, we always talk about the health benefits associated with water, but one of the mistakes we've made as a sector is we've sort of tended to exaggerate what the impact of water investments are. And there's not a sufficiently convincing evidence base to articulate some of those economic benefits. So even though you see some numbers about $1 invested in this gives you $15 return in healthcare benefits, it's not sufficiently rigorous to convince finances to support some of these investments. And so we need to do more work, both in terms of the health implications of our investments in water, but also some other sort of benefits that you get. So, you know, improving your water bodies improves property values, it improves, you know, tourism, it improves the livability of the city. These are all things that other sectors benefit from water sector investments. So how do we reconcile that, and how do we sort of crowd in funding from some of those other people where we're better able to articulate some of those economic benefits? We haven't done a very good job as a sector in trying to value some of these spillover effects of our investments, and we need a lot more work in that area. I've talked about the urban water sector, but you have to understand water is a system of systems, right? And so you can look at your drinking water supply as a system, your stormwater as a system, your wastewater as a system. Then you can sort of, that would be like your sparrow's view. You could move up to, say, an albatross view, where you look at your urban water system as one, so your drinking water, wastewater, stormwater as one. But then you can go to sort of the eagle's view and look at water from a catchment perspective. And what we find is that each of the different water users, they sort of optimize their systems independently. So the urban sector tries to optimize in isolation. The ag sector, the agricultural sector, tries to do the same. And people involved in nature-based solutions are doing something very similar. But there are lots of interconnections between these sectors. When you look at it from a catchment perspective, you see a lot of synergies taking place between each of these different water users. And we have models, sort of metabolism type models, that try to capture some of this, but the utilization of some of this is not still being used. And a lot of it has to do with fragmentation within, you know, the way in which water is managed, institutional fragmentation. If you take a country like India, for example, the urban sector and the ag sector should be like best cousins, because big water use, you know, there's a lot of wastewater that's generated in the city. It's very nutrient rich, and the ag sector can be a big beneficiary of that water, and that frees up water for the urban sector to use, because the ag sector uses a little bit more. So we need to have a more sort of systemic view of our watershed. We need to understand these interrelationships between these different actors. And I would say that, you know, the regulators have to get their mind around the fact that the urban water system sits within a catchment, and sometimes the investments made somewhere else or regulations somewhere else actually provides much more benefits to the urban water sector than just only focusing on the urban water sector. So in relation to what I've just said, you know, the regulations can really help change the default value of what we really think is sustainable water management. You know, regulations can reward things like water efficiency, resource use efficiency, this idea of extracting or encouraging people to extract waste value from their waste streams. It can promote a more holistic view of our water management. It can promote the sort of this hybrid of grey and green infrastructure. And it can also try to recognize this complex value of water and try to see how we can best capture some of these spillover effects, some of these additional economic benefits that come from water. The last sort of area that I wanted to talk about was really around the mitigation agenda and the push within the water sector to control some of their greenhouse gas emissions. And you know, there's a big move in the energy sector, so what we would call Scope 2 emissions. the energy that we import into our treatment plants to use. There's been a lot of innovation there, and they're predicting that in the next sort of, by 2030, nearly 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, 70 to 100%, will be from what we would call Scope 1 emissions. These are the emissions from the treatment plants themselves. And here we have some challenges of trying to understand what our emissions are from our treatment plants. And particularly of concern is things like methane production and also nitrous oxide. And these are much, much more potent than the carbon dioxide. I mean, methane is 25 times more potent, and nitrous oxide is nearly 300 times more potent. And we're not very good at estimating some of these, what we call fugitive emissions, from our treatment plants. And so we have a lot of work to do. If you look at these diagrams here, or if you look at these diagrams here, the IPCC has not done a good job in estimating what the nitrous oxide emissions are from treatment plants. And I think that they have had to sort of modify them consistently by several magnitudes of order to sort of work out approximately what's happening. But if you look at the graph on the left, it really shows you the nitrous oxide that's being produced from different types of treatment trains, right? So these are different treatment trains for a wastewater treatment works. And you can see that that varies, and you'd expect that because there are different technologies that are being applied. But the range for specific treatment trains is also varying. And this was a study where they looked at, I think, 51 plants. And this variation in the values of nitrous oxide shows that it's not only the treatment train that changes what the amount of emissions you generate, but also the local conditions in which that treatment plant sits, right? The environmental sort of setting in which it sits. So we have a lot of uncertainty associated with what the nitrous oxide production is. And on the right, you can see similar sort of analysis done in relation to methane. So there are challenges for us. If we're starting to impose regulations around greenhouse gas emissions, we don't know enough in terms of monitoring and understanding where these emissions are coming from and their magnitude and how are they impacted by the local environment in which the treatment work sits. So regulators have to sort of recognize that these are going to be challenging times for us. The other thing is, I would say, is that, you know, when you look at the Western European water sector, particularly again in terms of wastewater, because that's where a lot of the interest currently is. We started with very clunky systems, right? Very crude systems. And over the last sort of 50 years, we've started to improve and optimize these systems, right? And so you could think of the last 50 years almost like a big pilot study in terms of wastewater treatment. Now we've started to develop fairly efficient wastewater systems. And a lot of it is by changing the physics of the flows, right? So viscosity, for example, with thermal hydrolysis. And as a result, we have developed more efficient systems that have more smaller footprints. They're much more energy efficient. And you're seeing a lot of emerging economies, like in Eastern Europe, certainly in Asia and in South America and Africa, they are starting at a much better place because they have got all of this information at hand. So the way in which they're building their systems is much more intelligent than, say, the way in which the West, sort of by trial and error, developed these systems. But there's some interesting there's some sort of contradictions in that. So if you take, for example, employing energy efficient solutions, Anamox is one such solution that helps you remove your inorganic nitrogen from ammonia-rich wastewater. It is a very efficient, from an energy perspective, process. So the amount of energy you have to import from your electricity supplier is less because it's more energy efficient. But studies have shown that Anamox actually might generate a lot more nitrous oxides. So on the one hand, you're using less net energy, but on the other hand, you might be generating more greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's very important to differentiate between energy minimization and greenhouse gas emissions. They are not the same, right? And it may be better, and studies, we have some people within IWA who are working on this, particularly at Princeton, where they have shown that if a company can source its energy in a green way, so they really are buying all of their energy which is carbon neutral, it might be better for them to be more energy intensive because it means that they generate less greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite a counterintuitive thing. So if all the energy you're buying is green, then there's no need for you to have very efficient processes which might generate sort of fugitive emissions that you never anticipated. And for example, there are some innovations, particularly which use a lot of electricity, like electrolysis type methods, that allow you to strip a lot of the precursors that feed your fugitive emissions. And so this type of discussion has to be understood, because if the water sector goes very far in trying to reduce their energy, but they then result in much greater fugitive emissions, then they're going to have to undo that if they start to source predominantly green energy. And then they go into more energy intensive processes that really neutralize all the greenhouse gas emissions they might generate. So it's just something to think about, and this is still an area of research that people are looking into. So from a regulations point of view, I think it's important that regulators help guide utilities in delivering much lower energy footprints, but also reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, providing clarity on the difference between the two, and they're not always the same, and to have this sort of integrated view, right? So, you know, just looking at the water sector alone doesn't help. You have to look at the energy sector and the water sector through a single lens and see how much of my scope 2 emissions are green, and then how much effort do I need to put into my treatment works or my scope 1 emissions in response to that. And where is the biggest bang for your buck? Where do you get the biggest return on your investment? The last thing I wanted to just share with you before I close is this idea of readiness, right? We have a lot of utilities that know that they need to do these things. They have to become more efficient, they have to become more resourceful, so they have to use the water in a much more clever way, and they have to try and extract value from their waste streams, and they have to try and decarbonize as a sector, because these are all sort of pressures that are on utilities. So technology plays a big role, and we get hooked on thinking about technology, but there are lots of other things that affect the readiness of a utility to move in that direction. And I just wanted to share with you the way in which the European Union is working on this. Traditionally, we've talked a lot about technical readiness levels, TRL. And this is really a ladder, right? And so at the bottom of this ladder, the 1, 2, and 3, this is where a technology is being researched at a university, right? It's in a laboratory, they're trying it out. As you move up to sort of 4, 5, you're moving into sort of pilot studies. So you're starting to build something that looks more full scale. And then when you move up to 6, 7, 8, 9, it's really close to commercialization, right? So when they look at technologies, they are asked, where is it in this TRL ladder? Is it very early? So is it just in someone's mind as a potential sort of solution? Or is it sort of higher at 7, 8, 9, where it's close to commercialization and full-scale deployment? We've only tended to focus on technical readiness, right? The TRLs. But now there's this sort of introduction of something called the societal readiness level. Even if you bring up some of this innovation, is the society ready to absorb some of these changes? And are they willing to pay for some of these changes that you're planning to make? Does the utility itself have the capacity, right, to absorb this technology? Does it have trained staff that can implement some of these innovations that are coming forward? And most importantly, does the legal and regulatory framework allow the utility to use this technology? And it's not homogeneous, right? So if you say, for example, take energy recovery, the readiness levels across all of them is pretty high. And so you can probably move forward on sort of energy recovery in your treatment works. But when you look at something like reuse, technologically we're quite advanced. We know how to do the whole reuse stuff, right? But society's willingness to utilize water that's been used once already is a little lower. And certainly the regulatory frameworks inhibit the full uptake of some of this type of innovation. So it's only by understanding these 3 or 4 dimensions to readiness will we know if a new idea is really going to see full-scale deployment or not. It's not just that we've proven it works in a pilot study, right? So it's important to frame the way in which we're trying to move within these 4 sort of dimensions. So regulators, for me, are really key in driving and championing innovation for the water sector, because we certainly need to innovate. We can't continue as business as usual. I always finish my presentations with this slide for the last 10 years, and I suppose it still works. And forgive me, because it's from the US where I used to live, so it would fit, I think, in Romania, because you drive on the same side. But, you know, we can't stay in the same lane, business as usual, right? It's impossible, right? Global change pressures is making it impossible for us to continue doing water the way we did in the 19th and early 20th century. We have to change. Currently, most utilities are tinkering. They're trying to repurpose their existing infrastructure. They're trying to play with them here and there, retrofit. It's not that they don't have enough headroom to sort of really make the changes they need to. So really, we need to have this paradigm shift. We have to really rethink the way in which we use water, the way in which we reuse water. We have to rethink the design of our infrastructure so we can extract value from our waste streams. And we really have to understand that the readiness of a utility to move forward is not only about the technology, but it's about these other dimensions, the societal, organizational capacity, and also legal and regulatory framework. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.